Good afternoon. I was told that I can use this to attract your attention. Thank you very much for being resilient and staying until now. I know that it's very difficult to focus, and especially with such intensive panels and interesting panels, but also demanding in terms of your attention. My name is Maxim TIMOFEEV. I'm representing CEELI Institute, which is a Czech NGO, mostly working with legal programs for lawyers, judges, and prosecutors, trying to promote the rule of law internationally. It is my honor to be a moderator for this session that is bringing together a couple of important issues, starting with the political prisoners in Russia and the demand of freedom for them, but also bringing issues like sanctions and international tribunal for Putin. That's how it is framed in a program. So we will also touch upon issues of propaganda. So that would be a very diverse session. We will not have much time, but every speaker, I promise, will have at least one shot at a target. I will be speaking English, but speakers are free to choose any language that they want to talk, either English, not any, but English or Russian. I will briefly introduce all the speakers and then we will start. So we have Evgenia Kara-Murza, who is Advocacy Coordinator at Free Russia Foundation. Vadim PROKHOROV, who is a Russian lawyer, and you know that he is the lawyer who was defending Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, and Boris Nemtsov. We have Maksim OLENICHEV, a human rights defender from the first department project, or the department #1 project. Gleb BOGUSH, who is an expert in international law. Now he is in Copenhagen, in University of Copenhagen. Then we have Thibaut BRUTTIN, if I am correct in saying, in pronouncing your name, the Assistant Director General of Reporters Without Borders. Isabel WISELER-LIMA, the member of European Parliament. Ulla Hakkinen, who is the European External Action Service Deputy Head of Division for Russia. And the last minute addition to the panel, Karina Moskalenko, a human rights defender from Russia, the founder of the Center of International Protection. So with this, let me start with a couple of remarks. I think that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is indeed a turning point. And it's also an important point for this particular panel, not only the previous one. And many of the political prisoners in Russia, including Vladimir Kara-Murza, they are war protesters. They are there because they protested against the war. But the negative dynamics, they started a bit earlier, I mean, a bit before. We cannot say that it started together with the invasion of Ukraine in the February previous year. The war is in a way a tip and a tragic one of an iceberg. So what I want to ask is if you can think about what brought us to that point and what would be our actions, how do you see the actions of Russian anti-war movement at this point? Thank you very much. Evgenia Kara-Murza.
Right. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for offering us this amazing platform, and most of all, for their continued willingness to maintain a productive dialogue with representatives of Russian pro-democracy forces. It is a very important sign of that you not only understand and recognize our plight, but you also realize that Russia's future will affect us all. And I believe that this is truly important, that this realization is there. I would also like to thank Vice President Jourova for her heartwarming message of solidarity. It breaks my heart that every time I get to meet more of Vladimir's friends and colleagues around the world, it always happens when he's either in a coma or in prison. But it is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to be here today and to be offered this opportunity to make sure that Vladimir's voice continues to be heard. For 15 months, we have been witnessing a genocidal bloodshed in Ukraine. And the fact is that it was not unexpected, because Vladimir Putin did not become a maniacal killer overnight. War crimes in Chechnya and in Syria, the invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and violent squashing of peaceful protests in Russia, none of it provoked a truly serious, consequential response from either the Russian population or Western democracies. This year will mark the 20-year anniversary of the imprisonment of the last hostage of the Yukos case, Alexei Pichugin, 20 years behind bars in violation of 2 decisions of the European Court of Human Rights and multiple resolutions by the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers demanding his unconditional release. Political assassinations have become one of the regime's favorite methods of dealing with the opposition. Novaya Gazeta alone, whose editor-in-chief Dmitry Muratev, the co-recipient of the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize, spoke here today, lost 6 journalists to political assassinations. In 2015, the leader of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, was murdered just steps away from the Kremlin walls. My husband, Vladimir Kara-Murza, survived 2 assassination attempts, perpetrated by the same team of assassins in the service of the Russian state that poisoned Alexey Navalny with Novichok. The authorities have been carrying out consistent persecution of anyone connected with so-called undesirable or extremist organizations. Such entities include, for example, the Andrei Sakharov Foundation, opened in 1989 to honor the memory of Soviet dissident and Nobel Peace Prize winner Andrei Sakharov, the Free Russia Foundation, that I have the honor to work with, and the 2 investigative projects, Bellingcat and The Insider, that uncovered the names of those FSB officers who had twice poisoned my husband before carrying an attack on Alexey Navalny. Just to give a couple of examples, my husband's friend and colleague Andrei Pivovarov has been in prison for over 2 years now for being affiliated with Mikhail Khodorkovsky's Open Russia, considered undesirable by the Russian authorities, of course, and for daring to put forward his candidature in so-called elections. Another politician and activist from Ufa in Bashkortostan, Liliya Chanisheva, has been in prison for over a year for representing Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, labeled extremist by the Russian authorities. 2 decades of impunity have led Vladimir Putin to believe that he could get away with anything, and he launched a full-blown genocidal war of aggression against Ukraine that goes hand in hand with massive-scale repression in Russia. The regime has brought back the entire arsenal of Soviet-style repressive instruments, including punitive psychiatry, sexual violence, and Stalin-era prison terms of up to 15 years for protesting against the war. The use of intimidation and torture doesn't even surprise anyone anymore. A civil society activist, Mikhail Krieger, recently sentenced to 7 years in prison, said in his final statement to the so-called court, and I quote, "If you ever hear or read that Krieger had second thoughts or Krieger recanted and apologized, and so on, know that there is a dire threat to my family or me," end of quote. A month ago, my husband was sentenced to 25 years of strict regime in a Kafkaesque trial for high treason based on 5 public speeches. Like in the Soviet times, anyone who dares oppose the official narrative is being portrayed as either a criminal, a spy, or a traitor. According to the First Department Project, in the past month, treason charges have been brought against Ilya Baburin for a failed attempt to set fire to a military recruiting office, and at least 3 treason cases have been initiated for money transfers to Ukraine, including against 23-year-old Tamara Parshina. According to OVD-Info, an independent media project on political persecution in Russia, over the past year, there have been only 25 days during which no detentions or arrests have been reported in Russia. Among some 20,000 unlawfully detained, there were at least 565 minors, and criminal cases were initiated against 9 of them before they reached the age of 18. Everything I've told you now seems to describe quite a hopeless situation, but I urge you not to make such conclusions, because it also shows that no matter how hard the regime, armed with a well-oiled repressive machine and omnipresent propaganda, tries to convince the entire world of the Russian people's unequivocal support for Vladimir Putin's policies and the regime's war on Ukraine, there are thousands and thousands of Russian citizens who continue risking their freedom and very often their lives to demonstrate that this is not true. These people are the alternative to Vladimir Putin's regime, as are the ones gathered here today. They are the hope that Russia can and will be a democracy one day. It is up to us Russians to change the situation in our country, but in the face of this monstrous regime, we do need the support of and solidarity of the free world, of which we very much want to be part. As our younger daughter Sonia wrote in her school essay on political prisoners, and I quote, "Putin is trying to make them feel unheard and unseen, and we must make it known that we see, hear, and stand with them," end of quote. And I would like to finish with an excerpt from Vladimir's sort of a manifesto that he's written and sent from Moscow's 5th pretrial detention center. It is quite a long piece of work, but I only will read a small part of it. Political change in Russia is famously difficult to predict. The Romanov Empire and the Soviet regime appeared stable until both collapsed in literally 3 days in March 1917 and August 1991. Both times, the collapse was so sudden and unexpected that democratic reformers in Russia and Western democracies that were in a position to help came unprepared for the task before them. The prices of mistakes that resulted from this unpreparedness, both for Russia and for the rest of Europe, was enormous. Russian historian Vasily Kluchevsky once said that history doesn't teach anyone anything, it only punishes for lessons not learned. But this time, we must learn from past failures and not repeat them when Russia gets its next window of opportunity for change. That window could come at any moment. As before, it is certain to come unexpectedly and suddenly, which means we must be preparing tomorrow's changes today. It is clear that in order both to rebuild its domestic institutions and to regain its proper place in the world, the post-Putin Russia will need to undergo not only significant reforms in policy, but also a full-scale moral reckoning and renewal along the path traveled by Germany after 1945, by Latin American countries after the military dictatorships, by South Africa after apartheid, and by Central and Eastern European states after the fall of communism. It goes without saying that accounting for the Putin regime's crimes must include a full reconciliation with Ukraine, along with the return of occupied territories, the payment of just reparations, and the surrender of those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity for trial at an international tribunal. This is important not only for justice, but also for protecting against potential revanche by the old guard. President Yeltsin's biggest mistake was to reject such measures in the early 1990s, leaving the Soviet KGB unaccountable and essentially intact. The results were not long in coming. Evil must be publicly reckoned with and officially condemned. Only then will we be guaranteed from its repeat. Domestic and foreign policy in Russia are always inextricably linked. Just as under Putin, repression at home is matched by aggression abroad. The post-Putin Russia must respect both the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and the civilized norms of international behavior. It must also reorient its foreign policy to reflect our true national interest, being an integral part of the global community of developed democracies. In one of his last interviews, Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was asked to name the biggest difference between the Kremlin's worldview and his own. He responded simply, "I believe that Russia is a European country, and they don't." There is so much in this phrase. Russia is a European country by its history, by its culture, by its heritage, by its mentality, not to mention the fact that geographically it is the largest country in Europe. If we still believe in the goal of a Europe whole, free and in peace, and I certainly do, it can only be possible with a democratic Russia as part of it. It is the only way to guarantee long-term peace, stability and cooperation on our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evgenia, very much. Thank you for setting the scene, so to say, for this panel, but also for voicing this powerful statement of your husband. You said the so-called court sentenced my husband to 25 years of imprisonment. And my next, I'm turning to Vadim with the question of what are the challenges and how do we deal with the challenges of the lawyer going to so-called courts in Russia these days?
Thank you for passing the floor over to me. First of all, answering this question, I would like to pay your attention to the name of the panel. This is panel 4, Freedom to Political Prisoners in Russia, Personal Sanctions, International Tribunal for Putin, War Crimes and the Crime Against Humanity in Russia. The topic of this panel ties altogether the persecution of people in prison, sanctions, personal sanctions, tribunal for Putin, and this is absolutely right. As Sergei Davidis said earlier today, back in 1968, Andrei Sakharov, great humanist, wrote his article, Discussions of Progress, Intellectual Freedom and Democracy, where he discussed the respect of human rights and international security, and later, during his Nobel Prize lecture in 1975, Helena Bonner read it, if you protect human rights and respect them, then this country is safe to others, and internal reprisals lead to external aggression. And Evgenia repeats, external aggression and internal repression. These are absolutely merged things. They are forged, and these are the things that are happening in our country. Unfortunately, in recent years, I'm trying to answer this question. This idea has been supported and proven, and this is translated into using quasi-legal mechanisms to repress local people. So this is formally legitimate, but this is absolutely non-constitutional, and this is against the human rights. The very existence of the core of law does not mean that there will be arbitrary repressions against opposition and against the war. In the Wiener Constitution of Germany, it was stopped in June 1945 by Allies, but actually the fascists did not follow the Constitution, like the Putin's authorities did not follow the Constitution. And at the far front, we have our political prisoners, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Alexey Navalny, Ilya Yashin, Aleksey Gorinov, and many others. And we should say, indeed, prior to the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, Russia had a horrible situation with human rights, including prosecutions of multiple opposition leaders like Navalny was detained after being poisoned 1 year prior to the full-scale invasion. And the leader of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, was killed 7 years prior to the aggression next to the Kremlin walls. But after the occupation of the Crimea, it is evident that Putin's regime cleared the entire political landscape from its opponents in order not to face possible resistance of the society to its aggressive plans. And unfortunately, it was successful in many dimensions. As for the exercise of rights, legal defense is facing the quasi-legal steps of the authorities. The authorities adopted legislation on undesirable organizations, foreign agents. The Free Russian Foundation was called a non-desirable organization years ago, but not the very activities and operations, but it was the ground for accusing and sentencing Vladimir Kara-Murza. So the regime adopts the legislation like the anti-fake law, and then in an awkward and illegitimate enforcement norms are leveraged, and we unfortunately have to face it. In the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, there was no secret document on the public secret, state secret in the criminal case. The very case was called a closed one. The case files were secret, they were stored in a special office, and in the courtroom nobody could be there, neither the relatives, nor journalists, nor diplomatic corps, and even the corridor is cleared from visitors. It was room 421. Even Natan Sharansky, who is for Kara-Murza, he was judged in an open court in 1978. There were various state activists, but still it was open. And in our case, it was absolutely closed. And my personal conflict with the judge and the prosecutor started after every day after court hearing. I had to explain what happened during the court hearing. Therefore, indeed, after the full-scale invasion and reprisals were absolutely unlimited and unhidden, and they were adopting arbitrary laws, illegitimate laws, but Yashin, Gorin, Kara-Murza, and many others initially were detained and then sentenced for their anti-war position. I understand Vladimir Kara-Murza naturally is very annoying to them for his, first of all, role in the Magnitsky Act, but initially he was detained under Article 207.3 for taking the floor in Arizona in the House of Representatives, and it was in the sentence, and 2 out of 5 cases against him were on the war in Ukraine. As for Yashin, Gorin, and other Russian political prisoners, then the accusations were directly related to their anti-war position and the dissemination of truth about the crimes in Ukraine. And again, we are getting back to this dichotomy: repression inside the country and aggression outside. This is a typical trait of the fascism regime. Conclusion: in this horrible situation with the Russian judicial and law enforcement system, and the new system will not be created overnight after the defeat of the regime. We will have to develop it. Nothing can be achieved through using legal leverage if the regime is the same in the country. However, naturally, the legal leverages should be used in order to document the violations and crimes outside and inside, including those against political prisoners. Sooner or later, any war stops. Let's hope, as they said correctly, that there will be the defeat of the Putin's regime. Let's hope for that. In any case, there will be some peace, some negotiations, and as an obligatory condition or requirement, it should be not only returning the prisoners of war, returning the children who were hostage for them to be taken back, but also the political amnesty to all political prisoners in Russia. This should be a must, an obligatory requirement by the coalition against the Putin's regime. This will not only save the lives of our comrades who are behind bars, but this will also create a resource for Russia to survive, to build new Russia, and for the political and civic control over the authorities that will replace the current authorities after the current regime is defeated. After liberating political prisoners, any end or suspension of war, in my understanding, is impossible, and we should not discuss it. And ultimately, the last thing, the dimension that we have already mentioned, the legal support of sanctions, facilitation of investigations of war crimes, and the prosecution of the criminals. All shall be prosecuted, those who put the political prisoners into prisons. This was not done during the Yeltsin's times, like the attempt to have a court hearing against the constitutional, against the Communist Party, which failed. We should not let this happen again. There should be new legislation adopted in after Putin change, and this bifurcation period there will be a turnover, and we will have to suggest an absolutely new agenda. And the last thing, the idea of establishing a registration authority for registering the crimes against the Ukraine, like the court in Hague, and also establishing a new justice system in The Hague, and engagement of Russian lawyers in its operations. Thank you.
Almost everything that we were supposed to cover at this session, but we still need to give floor to other speakers. So I would remind that each of you most probably has 6 minutes, and maybe try to focus on something that the previous speaker didn't touch upon. I would like to pass the mic to Maxim to kind of speak in continuity to what Vadim was saying about the ways the oppressions take place in Russia, and focusing maybe on what is being done now, and what can be done.
Спасибо, дорогие всем. Я думаю, что мы все хотим.
Thank you. I believe that all of us want democracy to be in Russia, human rights to be fully respected and protected, and we need this, the citizens of Russia, in order to get back and to undertake a democratic transition in the country, in order to change it to the better, to build a peaceful European country without imperial thinking. And prior to 2022, it seemed possible that the Russian state was not at the bottom, but after February 24th, 2022, it was absolutely evident that the human rights protection system was not working. The political regime has been adopting laws to limit human and civic rights, making them null and void. Those who disagree will be politically prosecuted. I work in the first department legal project. We work on political treasure, and treason, and we act as agents of change. Since the moment of establishment of the first department and after the full-fledged invasion into Ukraine, we advise people for them not to be detained for fake allegations, and we succeed. We work on the forcefully moved persons and arbitrary detentions, and the Barcelona University believes that the apocalypse probability is higher than the probability that the human rights will be respected in Russia, because the probability is much less than apocalypse, and following the rules is a random thing. After February 24th, Russian authorities adopt totally legitimate laws, and they suppress any independent initiative in the civil society Russia has more than 500 foreign agents, 90 non-desirable organizations. Oppositional leaders are in prisons, but we do not know the number of political prisoners in the country. Our project works on non-media people who are randomly accused of treason without any grounds. The state uses the charges of the threat to national security, then that the national legislation is regularly amended. Cooperation with international or foreign organizations is a crime because this threats Russia, and the state treason charges are against those who have never dealt with state secrets, and people are put to prisons for fake crimes. In 2023, we can see that on a weekly basis, people are detained at random, being accused of treason because they work either at military factories or live next to the Ukrainian border. So the country, the state tries to build the environment of fear. They randomly pick up people and they face treason charges. And the investigators, judges, and prosecutors are liable for what they do, and this affects the situation in Russia, and they are responsible for that. So we have to save those who can be saved. We should help those who continue resisting to anti-democratic changes in Russia. All of them cannot flee from Russia. Not all of them want to. We have to create aisles of protection, and we should preserve the culture of democracy in Russia, and soon the modality of operations of such institutions will have to be changed because of the reprisals, and the public activities are under threat. But we should not be speaking about individual cases but about trends, and at that we should focus on some service support of some individuals, advisory work, but not strategic cases. Therefore, I believe we can focus on the following recommendations that can help change the situation. First, as said numerously today, we should be constantly in dialogue with the people who live in Russia. We should be guided by their needs when we design our programs and projects. Second, we should support grassroots anti-war initiatives working against the war both in Russia and abroad. 3, we should support grassroots initiatives in communities. These are the nodes of change. They can be improving their local landscape and their living standards. They will not be fighting for political rights. They will not protest. But if we have a long-term strategy, we should support these grassroots initiatives in places where it is still possible. Through these practices, people learn how to exercise democratic principles, and they expand them. Therefore, we can expand the range of our supporters of human rights, and they will help us recreate the democratic changes and become actors of change. The democratic community of Russia developed the best practices. After reprisals of 2020, this community develops what can be developed and keeps what can be done. They create this on a community level to exercise democracy at the lowest level possible. Next, personal sanctions should be imposed on those who are decision makers in political reprisals, members of parliament, prosecutors, investigators, judges, and the sanctions list should be operational. Personal sanctions should be against those who suppress civil society and who prosecute the agents of democratic change, foreign agents, undesirable organizations, people who are against the war. These are judges, people working in the prosecutor's office, investigators, and others. We should support independent media and fight state propaganda, trying to be heard by various people in Russia. We should save those who can be saved in Russia, in Russian state, and who can be subjected to charges. Therefore, we should be thinking of developing practices when European states would simplify legalization of these people, like expanding the sanction of providing humanitarian visas. Other countries of EU should do the same, and we should not forget about vulnerable groups in current situation. They are under additional pressure the last thing, we should review the lists of personal sanctions as the ground for future illustration. Without that, we won't be able to build democracy in the future. Thank you.
Not only human rights work, but also linking it to a democratic movement inside the country and the way human rights defenders can help, even if they are staying outside the country, which is a big challenge. And brings me to the next question, and we are now moving from the podium down to the audience in a way, and I'm giving the floor to Karina Moskalenko. Would you maybe talk about the international protection of human rights and the problems that we are facing right now? And I know that you're a very passionate speaker, but being passionate still, let's try to keep the time.
To be short. Of course, thank you for the floor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, because until the very end, very last minute, I didn't know that I can come. I would prefer speak Russian.
What we are doing today, those defense lawyers who continue working in Russia, and I would like to stress that in Strasbourg we have 3 to 4 lawyers, the core group of defense lawyers, human rights defenders, human rights lawyers work in Russia in various regions of the country, and we are proud of these people because they are at the forefront of this fight. This is an unequal fight, because we are protecting political prisoners, political detainees. We protect victims of political assassinations, like we represented the family of Anna Politkovskaya. We are still proving that Yuri Shikachikhin was assassinated. It was a political assassination, and we continue doing that, working on that. All of our defense lawyers, as Max said it rightly, we bring these cases to international courts. And earlier, the European Human Rights Court was available to us, but now Russians can hardly use this mechanism, but we leverage the mechanism of the Human Rights Committee of the UN. And there, we bring these cases, we submit them, and we won over 600 cases in the European Human Rights Court. And the Human Rights Committee of the UN is not that familiar to Russians, and we will have to use it. And while Russia recognizes the competence and authority of these institutions, we should use them. And as Vadim PROKHOROV said, until the last moment, our lawyers work legally as lawyers, as defense lawyers, and we continue staying there, and we are trying to support our colleagues. And by protecting individuals who are from the opposition, political prisoners, like the New Greatness Youth Group, or right now I have a case on the leaders of the Ingush protest and the UFIM 20 and other groups. These groups are charged and they are sentenced, and they are the victims of the regime. We protect Sergei Makhnatkin, who already died, but we continue working on that through the Human Rights Committee of the UN and the European Court. We create a new Makhnatkin list, and you can see the lists of doctors of and those who prison officers and law enforcers, doctors, medical doctors, were not documenting torture. I can hear recollections of those who were not known to us by names, but they were against the war and they became victims, and they are sentenced for many years. Today we protect defense lawyers who are disbarred, who are arrested. Nobody speaks about Dmitry Talantov. I would like to raise the issue. This is the president of the Udmurt Bar Association. He is the president of the regional bar. He was detained, he was arrested, and he's still behind bars. Not because he, as a lawyer, made something wrong, or maybe he was too brave. However, he's a brave lawyer, but because he expressed his thoughts on Bucha and other crimes. He was saying harsh words about the indifference of the Russian society towards these crimes, and he immediately was detained, and the Human Rights Committee applied the emergency procedure, and they communicate with the Russian authorities, and the Russian authorities have to respond to the Human Rights Committee of the UN. And it's easy for me to talk to Ukrainians when we work in our, how we call it, bilateral group. It's a Ukrainian-Russian group. We protect Ukrainians who are arbitrarily arrested in Russia, but I understand why my Ukrainian colleagues do not do this openly, but also for our lawyers. It's not an easy situation, so it is a very difficult situation. And it's easy for me to talk to Ukrainian media when they give me the floor in order for me to address Russians, that they can still protect themselves through international institutions. And again, this is the Human Rights Committee, like a treaty body, and the whole list of the treaty authorities. What Russian lawyers do today, I have a minute, okay. Without being supported of the Federal Bar Association, I'm not going to speculate about that, but all of us should understand that no Federal Bar Associations will protect no lawyer. Maybe the Moscow Bar Association can do it, but they recall the license of my friend Ilya Novikov. We managed to keep him in the bar some time ago, but I would like to refer to what beautiful representative of Ukraine said today, who is with us today as a colleague, who was addressing us as a colleague. He said, in order to have a good, common future, we should build our good old past. And today, Russian lawyers say, well, some people accuse them of legitimizing the illegal system of the state, but I was given the floor at the Supreme Court, and I asked a political prisoner who was my defendant, maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Alexander Shestun said, thank you for being here with me today at this court hearing. Yes, I do know that our efforts are doomed, but we today, we lawyers, especially those who are at the forefront in Russia, we are building a common, old good past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karina, for bringing this issue of persecuting lawyers. The same happened in Belarus, as we know, that they started attacking the lawyers, and the lawyers are there to protect those who are being persecuted by the state. If there are lawyers under the attack, everybody is vulnerable. And this is a very important topic. Thank you very much. Now, from this human rights field, we are moving to another field. And of course, the oppressions, the war in Ukraine became possible because of the control Putin's regime has over Russian society, and that control has been achieved also by quasi-legal means, but not only. And I think Thibaut here will talk about propaganda. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I work for Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Без Границ, and we are a press freedom organization. I remember a few years ago, I was collecting the mail from our organization, and we received a letter from Margareta Simonian. And she said, well, we're being expelled from the Baltic countries, and I would like you, as a press freedom organization, to support us. That was a big trigger. And I have the letter, I can prove it. So it means that today we need to be better at distinguishing what is journalism from propaganda. I'd like to say two things. First, there are things we can do today. And second, there are things we can do the day after, because it's the name of the conference. What we can do today, of course, is to support those who are producing independent content in Russian language towards the Russian Federation public. There is an amazing resilience from the journalism community from Russia in exile. There is a relief effort. More could have been done, more could be done, but the results are here, and we see that there is a vibrant community in many ways. But I would like to emphasize the fact, especially as there are some members of parliament here today, about the fact that the response of democracies could be stronger in that, because there are loopholes within the way democracies operate. Democracies have been pretty weak in their response to foreign propaganda broadcast or spread within the territory of the European Union. It's a kind of inherent vice for democracies to be, working based on reciprocity mechanism, trying to, facilitate and favor the neutrality of infrastructure. And we believe that is right, but a government like the government of Russian Federation has used false symmetries. You are suppressing Russia Today in your country, we are taking down BBC. Changing things so as to present a public service media just like a state media is not fair. So we believe that there is more thinking to be done in order to bridge these loopholes. We see lots of stakeholders within the field of information which are a bit lost. They don't know what to do. Some regulators, some social media platforms. We, as RSF, have fought a case against the French regulator, which was refusing to regulate the activities of Eutelsat, the French satellite company. The French satellite company is broadcasting towards the Federation of Russia content like Channel 1, Pierre Canal, RT, and so on. It's possible because of the help of European companies. We think that should be stopped. The neutrality of infrastructure should not be something that goes against the integrity of the infrastructure. There are international law, there are treaties, there are covenants, and these should be respected. We see the same thing with, I won't name any, but like social media platforms, news aggregators, which are, a bit lost between obeying to Roskomnadzor or, trying to help independent media. So we think it's about time that there is a global thinking, or at least a European thinking of the information space and the rules and duties of those who work in there. It's really important because the media outlets are the collateral victims of what happens. So RSF is working towards making relationship efficient with the platforms. We're also trying to build satellite capacities, and this can be done today in order to change the way. About the day after, because I know time is limited. I would like to say that just as, I think the European Union might have been naive in some ways, we are seeing a case study about propaganda. The budget of the Russian Federation's authorities in terms of disinformation propaganda was about a billion per year. We at RSF have investigated on several situations which are really, really obvious. For example, the day after the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, territories that were occupied by the Russian army, in the mailbox of people, you had actual, leaflets to subscribe to new satellite packages. So now today we're talking about, hybrid war. This is a reality. You plan your war, you plan your media, and you plan your propaganda. We have done a report on Mr. Malkiewicz, for example, who's a kind of operative of the Prigozhin operations in territories occupied in Ukraine. And we think that these are the grounds, the basis for legal prosecution in the future. Because if you look at what is today propaganda, there is a kind of gap, because it is not fake news, it's not totally disinformation. If you look at a declaration of 2017 by several UN rapporteurs, there is this idea that what is specific to propaganda is the fact that there is an intent to mislead the population. And that's not totally taken into account when you look at the way we can associate propaganda with crimes against war or against peace, crimes against humanity and genocide. We think that there is probably a possibility in the future to try and advocate for a specific crime of propaganda. We're not saying we're going to do it. We think it's worth investigating because what we see is of unprecedented magnitude. It has consequences which are horrific. And it's something that could be done by doctrine. So we're looking at publications that can be made by experts. It could be done by international law, or it could be done by jurisprudence. RSF has engaged in a dialogue with the General Prosecutor of Ukraine in order to debate how that could be done. And I wanted to be present today to encourage on whatever we can do today or what we can do tomorrow. All persons of goodwill to join us in that effort, because if we want to succeed, we will need to be centralizing efforts, because it's a huge task in order to recognize propaganda as something that's not just a lie, it's something that has lots of implications on people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Thibaut, for being very, very efficient and respecting the time. But also, I haven't realized that the issue of propaganda is so legal. So before you started speaking, because then I realized that there are much more legal points made there than I would have expected. And thank you for that. Now we are moving to the field of international diplomacy, politics, and justice. And I do understand that the question of international justice is a question of law, but in many ways, the establishing an institution that would produce justice, that would deliver justice, is a matter of politics. So that's how the issue of law and international law and politics interrelated. And I would like to give a floor to Ulla Häkkinen, who would speak about the, as far as I understand, EU efforts in international field. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening from my side as well. I will speak in English. And for me, it's enormous honor to be here, really, with people whose work I follow on a daily basis, whose well-being I worry about on a daily basis. So to be on the same panel with you is something special, a highlight of the week, and it's only Monday. So it's going to be a good week, I suppose. I fully subscribe to what was mentioned by others already, that we really see how in Russia today external aggression and internal repression are linked. Since the start of the full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine, we really see how also on the domestic scene, the repression is accelerating, both in terms of restrictive legislation and increased number of human rights violations. And Russian authorities have really increased their effort to crack down on journalists, on human rights defenders, which definitely means also human rights lawyers. And I'm very grateful that the work done in Russia, across Russia, is highlighted here. But also activists or any random anti-war thought, old social media posts. And all this aims to silence any criticism against the war, but also any criticism against the regime. We've seen Russia expanding the foreign agent legislation. We have the undesirable organizations. We also see the misuse of anti-extremism organization. Continued unlawful actions in Chechnya, I want to mention here, as well as discrimination of LGBTI people. And all this we see as a result in Russian courthouses, the so-called trials that do not meet the international standards of a fair and public hearing by a competent, impartial, and independent tribunal. Now, what we as the EU can do about it, I want to highlight a few strands of work. One is, of course, that with our EU delegation in Moscow and other EU and other diplomats, we continue to monitor the trials. It was mentioned here that, unfortunately, often they are behind closed doors, but our colleagues nevertheless go there to show, to pay attention to what is happening in that building. We have, since 2020, we have a human rights sanctions regime on a global human rights sanctions regime to address serious human rights violations. We have an independent media which is reporting always in advance what we are doing with that sanctions regime. So unfortunately, I'm not yet in a position to go further than that. But anyway, we are using that regime. And then what I also want to highlight is the public statements. It sometimes maybe feels frustrating. Is this all that we can do, that we say things? But this does matter, to call the names, to remember Alexey Navalny, Vladimir Kara-Murza, but also many others. I here just to name few, want to mention Ilya Yashin, Ivan Safronov, Lilia Chenicheva, Yuri Dmitriev. I'm personally from Finland, and of course him and what happened in Sandarmohi is extremely important. Andrei Pivovarov. And then last, I want to say a few words what we do on the international arena. Indeed, since Russia left the Council of Europe, the UN system is increasingly important. We do try to see how the committees at the UN could be enhanced so that they can maybe take some of the caseload. And then also the special rapporteur that the UN Human Rights Council now has nominated is extremely important. EU was a driving force behind her nomination, and we hope that you all cooperate with her so that this can be maximally used. Very last point, this indeed is a challenging panel to have so many important aspects in one, but I want to say just a few words about accountability, which is extremely important. In the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, we are supporting Ukrainian authorities to investigate and prosecute the crimes. We support national investigations in a number of EU member states which have universal jurisdiction. Of course, we very much support the International Criminal Court. This has been our hope to see this court and support its work always. And now the first arrest warrants issued to President Putin and to Maria Lvova-Belova are an important first step. We have established the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, and we are launching a system how it can collect evidences. And then obviously there is the important discussion about the Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression, where at this point I can just say from the side of the EU that we want to see it in place as soon as possible. We still need some discussions on details, what kind of arrangement will be put in place. What for us is extremely important that it will garner a wide international support, the tribunal that exists, that we do manage to have it also legitimate and interesting for other continents, and this way counter the narrative that the war in Ukraine would somehow be only a matter for Europe. It's not. It is about values, universal values, and that's why we want the whole world to be on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulla, for enlightening us about the efforts that EU institutions are making in the field of international politics, but also the accountability issue. I do understand that during the times of war, and especially such a devastating war as Russia now wages in Ukraine, the diplomacy is not the most fashionable word. And it's not, in a way, invited, but diplomacy serves many purposes. And as you said, we need to gather the support, for example, for the accountability mechanisms. And that's very important. And with that, I'm giving the floor to Isabel WISELER-LIMA, who will talk about the efforts in accountability arena.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be with this audience. So thank you very much for being here and saying all you have said until now. So today we are facing an era of war and utmost suffering for Ukraine. Since the very beginning of the war, Ukrainians have shown unprecedented courage and resilience, but the perspective of peace is only possible with further support of other democratic institutions. This unprovoked aggression of Russia against Ukraine is unprecedented, as so must be the sanctions and the international legal response. The EU has already imposed massive sanctions against the Russian government and the individuals involved in the massacre. But this is not enough. Sanctions are international but not global. India and Brazil have not adopted any sanctions, for example. Since day one, Ukrainian civil society, non-governmental organizations, investigators from all over the world, and the media have contributed to seek for peace and justice. Since day one, the EU has insisted that the perpetrators of war crimes shall be held accountable and that no place will be left for impunity. We have to keep our promises. We have to relay the struggle of those fighting for democracy, to show them their fight is not vain, also in Russia. To prove aggression gives rise to international responsibilities. For what concerns the different legal actions, we know it is hampered by the fact that Russia nor Ukraine are signatory of the Rome Statute, and that Russia does not intend to accept the ICC jurisdiction, and that thus Russia, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has a veto over any action of this body, which is ironic since its primary responsibility is to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security. The best available option, as for now, seems to be the creation of an ad hoc tribunal to make up for the lack of competence of the existing courts. We have to put all our efforts into it and to continue to call for an immediate creation of an appropriate legal basis to enable the establishment of a special international tribunal to punish the crime of aggression committed against Ukraine. And perhaps our expert will also talk about the fact that it could be inspired by the hybrid tribunals in Sierra Leone and Cambodia. And in fact, we should make sure that a special international tribunal should have jurisdiction to judge not only Vladimir Putin and the political and military leaders of the Russian Federation, but also Alexander Lukashenko and the political and military leaders of Belarus, responsible for facilitating the war of aggression waged against Ukraine by making its territory and logistical assistance available to the Russian Federation. First and foremost, this ad hoc tribunal would be an opportunity to seek justice for the Ukrainian people and to dissuade other international actors from imitating Russia's illegal aggression. The creation of this tribunal would also send a clear signal to Russia's political and economic elites and its allies that with Putin as president, it is no longer possible for Russian Federation to establish normal relations with the West. History has shown that without international assistance and involvement, it's difficult to fairly and effectively prosecute foreign nationals in ordinary domestic jurisdictions. However, it should not be forgotten that without the cooperation of the states on which it depends to conduct its investigations, execute its arrest warrants and implement its decisions, international criminal justice cannot function. This is why, more than ever, we must stay united and fight all together. Also, I would even say, especially with Russian opposition, for our democratic values. Because the war that is shaking Europe did not, and it was said before, begin in February 2022 and is not confined to the borders of Ukraine. It has been going on for years and touches the very heart of our cities and democracies. This is a clash between the autocratic world against the democratic world, with Ukraine on its front line. This war is aimed at us and we cannot lose it. It's time for us to act and to call for the creation of an adequate international legal response, as I'm convinced that a lasting peace must be founded on justice. I also want to highlight that from the beginning on, we have put the focus on Russian opposition and how Russians have put their life at risk to speak up. And we will continue to do so. We have also, before that, we have put light on the opposition in Russia. We have given the Sakharov Prize to Navalny. And we have made, it's emotional, we have made actions to support your husband. And I think this is very important that we continue to do. One single word also on the journalists. I think it's not a hazard if there are so many journalists in autocratic prisons. It's because democracy lives from free-speaking journalists. And the very, very last word, there is the propaganda, there are the fake news, there is a whole ensemble of facts that are used to really undermine democracy. The fact is that what is this hybrid war that has been done is to undermine democracy by bringing the people in the democratic states to have the sensation that they can't anymore know what is the truth. It's not even only to spread lies, it's to get people to don't trust anymore in being able to have the truth. And that's catastrophic for democracy, because democracy lives on truth. Thank you so much for everything you are doing.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you for stating that the sustainable peace is not possible without justice, and that the accountability for war crimes, the accountability for crimes against humanity, and accountability for the war of aggression should be delivered. And the question that I have to our last speaker in our panel, and we are being really effective because we started almost 20 minutes ahead of time, and we are finishing almost on time. So the two questions that I have is why the Tribunal for the crime of aggression is so important, and the second, what can Russian democratic movement outside Russia and inside Russia do in this regard?
Thank you. Great distinction to be here, and it would be maybe easier to elaborate on that, because I agree actually with every word that have been said. I will speak in Russian. То, что мы с вами обсуждаем,
what we're discussing today, I have heard this main idea which goes through all the presentations, the connection between the aggression against Ukraine and repression against and destruction of the political system inside Russia. What is happening since at least 2014 has its clear name in the international law, in particular in international criminal law. This is the crime of aggression. And this crime is central. It includes and not only explains the crimes committed in Ukraine, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, but maybe not legally, but at least causally, they include the human rights violations and the crimes conducted in Russia as well. This is why the accountability is a very important affair. If today we miss this chance, I speak about the entire world community, then definitely the point that international law and the international community as such is not capable of responding to the threats, and the very existence will unfortunately be confirmed once more. So, in my view, we are in a very important point in which the aspects of international criminal law are not only up to scientific discussions between lawyers. These are the issues which are of interest for every one of us. This is why, definitely, this discussion about the tribunal is not only about the format and the legal grounds, and about ensuring international support and legitimacy. It's about whether we use this unique historical chance when the crime of aggression would be properly assessed by the International Tribunal. I think this can be a very specific step from the Russian democratic opposition or democratic community to support this initiative. This tribunal, about which we are speaking now, this is the format and the institution which not only enable to cover the gap in the international legal architecture, but this will also be an institution which not only Ukraine needs, but also Russia. The aggression occurred not just because the political and legal institutions were destroyed in Russia, but also because the previous cases of crimes, both inside Russia and also outside Russia, and the aggression is not the first. We can discuss the interpretation, but it's not the first case when the international law was breached, and also the use of force against other countries. We're done with impunity and without proper international legal response. So currently this is first of all in our best interest. So I have a very clear suggestion to participants of this dialogue, is to support the initiative, primarily supported by Ukraine. It's one of the tough battles that Ukraine is fighting. This is the legal battle. The initiative on launching this tribunal is not supported by everyone. This is not some technical debate. The option which is now proposed as an alternative, the creation of a Ukrainian trial supported by international community, definitely it might look attractive for common people, but this option would not be the best vehicle to exercise the international law, to come up with international judgment on what has happened, because These events are not only relevant for Ukraine. These actions are about the entire complex of the factors which stood behind this aggression. Moreover, the aggression is not the problem of Ukraine. This is a problem of entire Europe and the entire international community. So I assume that it's in the best interest of the Russian society, and also as a step towards realization of this need of accountability and the need of international institutions, would be to support this initiative. And definitely this step not only would bring Russia closer again to the European community, but it would also bring this so far very distant prospect of making peace with Ukraine. At this point, unfortunately, we don't see it as realistic in the nearest future, but any step that we make should include this perspective. We should do everything that would make this prospect closer, even if it happens in many years from now. The last thing I'd like to say is that, of course, the Tribunal initiative is by far not the only thing we should be discussing about. We have already mentioned the International Criminal Court and the importance of supporting this investigation done by the court, especially in the current context when the Russian authorities intimidate. Also, they apply reprisals for cooperation with ICC. It's also important to speak about the future. The future, which is not possible without restoration of Russian national justice system and prosecution in Russia. So not only sustainable peace or any meaningful future would not be possible. All these things, of course, will not stop the war. They will not be able to create peace immediately, but peace is not possible without it. If we want this disaster not to repeat itself, neither in our region nor anywhere else, definitely we must act in this direction. It was very well said today that we never have someone else's freedom. Justice is no one someone else's either.
And justice for Russia is also justice for Ukraine and for Europe. Спасибо.
Thank you.
I'm told by organizers that we have in terms of time. So I would like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much for making those presentations very powerful and informative. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being very attentive. Thank you.
Excuse me, please. I have one remark. Как говорят в России,
As they say in Russia, this is on the housekeeping matters of a higher level meeting. Everybody is talking about that in the corridors. Gender balance was hugely violated, and we are fixing it. So this is this session is more or less rebuilding the gender balance and what
democracy, I would say. It's a violation of gender balance. И эта проблема...
And this is the problem of Russian politicians, opposition and the civil society.